What if some of the world's most massive stone structures don't belong where we've placed them in history at all? Why do civilizations separated by oceans move stones weighing hundreds, sometimes thousands of tons, using methods we still can't fully reconstruct? Why are foundations often far older and more precise than the cultures credited with building on top of them? And why do so many of these sites appear tied to vanished climates, rising seas, and forgotten landscapes? If mainstream timelines explain everything, why do these contradictions keep surfacing? And what, exactly, existed here before the world we inherited? Baalbek. At the northeastern edge of Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, where the land opens wide between the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountain ranges, Baalbek rises quietly above the surrounding plain, its colossal stones appearing almost incidental against the scale of the landscape, yet persistently unsettling upon closer inspection, as though they belong to a different order of construction than the temples that now sit upon them. Known in antiquity as Heliopolis, the site is most famous for its Roman sanctuary dedicated to Jupiter, whose surviving columns rank among the tallest ever erected in the ancient world. But beneath the familiar Roman architecture lies a deeper foundation that resists easy categorization, composed of limestone blocks so immense that their purpose and method of emplacement continue to provoke careful scrutiny rather than confident explanation. Central among these are the stones of the Trilithon, 3 blocks set into the western retaining wall of the temple platform, each measuring approximately 19 meters in length, over 4 meters in height, and weighing in excess of 800 tons. Placed with a precision that leaves seams scarcely perceptible even today, and aligned in a manner that suggests deliberate engineering rather than symbolic display. Nearby, in the same quarry from which these stones were extracted, lies the so-called Stone of the Pregnant Woman, larger still at an estimated 1,000 tons. Abandoned mid-process, as if the builders reached a practical or conceptual limit that could not be surpassed, followed by the later discovery of an even larger block beneath it, suggesting not a single failed attempt, but an extended phase of quarrying ambition. Roman builders are traditionally credited with Baalbek's monumental platform, and there is no question that Rome possessed remarkable organizational capacity, skilled engineers, and advanced lifting technologies. Yet the scale of these foundation stones stands apart even within the Roman world, exceeding those used in other imperial projects, and raising the question of why such extraordinary effort would be expended on stones that were ultimately hidden from view, forming part of a substructure rather than an elevated monument. The platform itself appears layered, with smaller, more typical Roman masonry resting atop much larger and more archaic blocks, a stratigraphy of stone that mirrors a deeper stratigraphy of occupation, as earlier Phoenician, Hellenistic, and possibly even pre-Phoenician phases are hinted at through fragmentary remains and ambiguous alignments. The site's location, commanding fertile land and intersecting ancient trade routes, would have made it valuable long before Roman incorporation, and classical sources suggest that Baalbek was already a significant cult center when Rome arrived, its sacred identity absorbed rather than created. Some researchers have noted that the megalithic stones of the foundation do not conform neatly to Roman construction norms, particularly in their size relative to function, and the absence of similar examples elsewhere in the empire, while others argue that Baalbek represents an outlier driven by imperial excess rather than a different cultural inheritance. Yet the logistical challenges remain substantial. The quarry lies uphill from the platform, eliminating the advantage of gravity. And while rollers, sledges, capstans, and earthen ramps have all been proposed, no definitive reconstruction has demonstrated how stones of such mass could be moved, lifted, and set with the observed precision using known Roman methods without leaving clearer traces of the infrastructure required. Over time, the idea has emerged cautiously, not as a declaration but as a question that the Romans may have inherited and repurposed an earlier megalithic foundation, adapting it to their architectural language while leaving its deeper origins unrecorded, either because they were already forgotten or because they were deemed irrelevant to imperial narrative. This possibility is complicated by the absence of written records describing a pre-Roman megalithic phase, though silence in the historical record is not uncommon, particularly for cultures that did not leave extensive texts or whose archives did not survive. Geological analysis confirms that the stones are local limestone, ruling out exotic sourcing but not explaining the choice of extreme size. And while tool marks suggest the use of metal implements consistent with later periods, erosion and reworking obscure definitive attribution. Baalbek's endurance through earthquakes, invasions, and religious transformations adds another layer to its ambiguity, as each civilization that encountered the site appears to have recognized its significance without fully redefining it, as if constrained by the weight and permanence of what was already there. In modern times, the idea that Baalbek's foundations might predate known civilizations has been linked, cautiously or otherwise, to broader discussions about lost phases of human history, particularly those imagined to have ended with climatic upheavals at the close of the last ice age. Yet such connections remain speculative, resting more on absence of explanation than on direct evidence. Still, Baalbek resists being reduced to a solved problem, because even within conservative archaeological frameworks, it represents an extreme expression of stone architecture that sits at the edge of what is comfortably explained, and its foundations continue to prompt detailed study rather than dismissal. The site does not announce its mystery loudly. It offers no inscriptions proclaiming forgotten kings or vanished worlds. Only stone upon stone, fitted so carefully that time itself seems to pass over them without fully claiming them. As the Roman columns above crumble and the city around it changes, the platform remains, quiet and immovable, suggesting that whatever purpose first demanded stones of such scale was rooted not in spectacle but in permanence, and that Baalbek, long before it became a Roman sanctuary, may already have been anchored to a deeper past, whose outlines are still visible only in the shadows cast by its enduring stone. Tiwanako and Puma Punku. On the high plateau of the Bolivian Altiplano, where thin air stretches beneath an immense sky and Lake Titicaca lies like a remnant of an inland sea, the ruins of Tiwanako and its satellite complex Puma Punku rest in a landscape that feels deliberately remote, as though distance itself were part of their design. Situated at nearly 3,850 metres above sea level, the site occupies a region where agriculture is difficult, timber is scarce, and modern visitors often struggle to reconcile the monumentality of the ruins with the apparent limitations of their environment. Tiwanako is conventionally dated to the 1st millennium CE, and associated with a powerful Andean state that flourished long before the rise of the Inca. Yet even within this accepted framework, the site displays an architectural ambition that appears unusually advanced for its time and place, marked by an emphasis on precision stonework, formal symmetry, and an apparent mastery of large-scale planning. The core of the ceremonial centre includes the Akapana Pyramid, a stepped earthen and stone structure aligned with cardinal directions. The Kalasasaya enclosure with its finely dressed walls, and the iconic Gate of the Sun, carved from a single block of andesite and adorned with a complex relief whose calendrical interpretations remain debated. Nearby, separated by a shallow depression, lies Puma Punku, a sprawling field of stone elements that at first glance appears chaotic, yet upon closer examination reveals a system of modular blocks, interlocking joints, and standardized proportions that suggest deliberate design rather than collapse alone. The stones here are among the most striking at any ancient site, composed primarily of andesite and red sandstone, some weighing well over 100 tons, quarried from sources many kilometers away, including the Copacabana Peninsula across Lake Titicaca, implying the transport of massive materials over water or rugged terrain, with no evidence of wheeled vehicles or large draft animals. What distinguishes Puma Punku most clearly is not sheer size, but precision. Blocks are cut with flat surfaces, sharp internal angles, and uniform dimensions, often shaped into complex H-forms that appear to function as structural connectors, fitting together with tolerances that in some cases approach modern stone masonry. Drill holes, grooves, and recessed channels recur throughout the site, suggesting standardized methods and possibly specialized tools, though no definitive examples of such tools have been recovered. Copper-based implements are known from the region and could account for some shaping techniques when combined with abrasion. Yet the consistency across dozens of blocks implies a level of planning and quality control that challenges assumptions about decentralized or ad hoc construction. Tiwanako's cultural reach is well established through ceramics, iconography, and settlement patterns across the Andes, indicating a society capable of organizing labor and sustaining long-term projects. But Puma Punku stands apart even within this context, as if it represented either an experimental architectural phase or the adaptation of an inherited design tradition whose original rationale had already begun to fade. Radiocarbon dates from organic material beneath parts of the site cluster around the mid-1st millennium CE, anchoring Puma Punku firmly within the known Tiwanako horizon. Yet these dates reflect activity at the site rather than the initial cutting of the stone itself, leaving room for debate about whether construction reused earlier foundations or materials. The ruins show signs of violent destruction, with massive blocks scattered and overturned, leading to speculation about seismic activity or deliberate dismantling, though the precise sequence of events remains unresolved. Later Andean cultures, including the Inca, regarded Tiwanako as a place of profound antiquity, incorporating it into their own origin myths and attributing its construction to a distant, almost mythic past, a perception that reflects cultural memory rather than chronological measurement, but nonetheless underscores the site's deep temporal presence in the Andean world. Modern interpretations have sometimes extended this sense of antiquity into claims of extreme age or lost global civilizations, often focusing on the apparent technical sophistication of the stonework. Yet such claims typically exceed the available evidence, relying on visual impression rather than stratified data. Still, even within cautious scholarship, Tiwanako and Puma Punku occupy a liminal position, representing a convergence of environmental challenge, organizational complexity, and architectural precision that is not easily reduced to simple explanations. High Plateau offers little margin for error, and any society building here would have required a stable cosmology, efficient food production, and a compelling reason to invest in monuments whose scale far exceeded immediate practical needs. As the stones lie today, weathered by centuries of frost and sun, they retain the impression of an architectural language that was once complete and internally coherent, even if its grammar is no longer fully legible. Tiwanako does not present itself as an isolated anomaly, but as part of a longer Andean continuum. Yet within that continuum it remains singular, suggesting that at some moment in the deep past of the Altiplano, human intention aligned with environment and material in a way that produced something both durable and difficult to place, leaving behind a field of stone that continues to invite careful observation rather than final answers, and reminding us that the limits of ancient achievement are often revealed not by what has vanished, but by what still endures. Saxsayhuaman, above the modern city of Cusco, where the Andes fold sharply into one another and the horizon fractures into ridges and valleys, the walls of Saxsayhuaman rise in a long, zigzagging sweep of stone, commanding the landscape with a presence that feels both deliberate and restrained, as though the builders were less concerned with height than with permanence. Traditionally attributed to the Inca, who shaped Cusco into the ceremonial heart of their empire in the 15th century, Sacsayhuaman is often described as a fortress, though its form and location suggest a broader ceremonial and symbolic role, integrated into the sacred geography that defined the city below. The three massive terraced walls are composed of enormous limestone blocks, some weighing well over 100 tons, fitted together with extraordinary precision, their irregular faces interlocking so tightly that even now, centuries after construction, a blade cannot be slipped between them. Unlike the finely dressed ashlar seen in later Inca buildings, these stones retain complex, organic shapes, shaped to meet one another across multiple planes, implying a construction process that prioritized stability and seismic resilience over visual uniformity. Earthquakes have repeatedly shaken Cusco, toppling Spanish colonial buildings while leaving Sacsayhuaman's walls largely intact, reinforcing the impression that the site embodies a form of engineering knowledge grounded in close observation of local conditions rather than abstract theory. The scale of the stones, however, raises persistent questions about logistics, as the nearest quarries lie several kilometers away and at different elevations, requiring the movement of massive blocks across uneven terrain without the use of iron tools, wheeled transport, or large domesticated animals capable of hauling extreme loads. Chroniclers of the early colonial period describe thousands of labourers moving stones using ropes, levers, and coordinated effort. Yet these accounts, written decades after the fact, read as attempts to make sense of something already perceived as astonishing, rather than precise technical documentation. The Inca state was undeniably capable of mobilizing immense labour forces through systems of obligation, and its road network and administrative organization were without parallel in the pre-Columbian Americas. But even within this context, Sacsayhuaman stands apart, suggesting either an extraordinary investment of resources or the continuation of an earlier building tradition that the Inca inherited and expanded. Archaeological evidence indicates that the hill of Sacsayhuaman was occupied long before the Inca, with earlier cultures shaping the landscape through terracing and ritual use, and some researchers have noted differences in masonry style between the largest foundation stones and smaller upper additions, hinting at multiple construction phases. The Inca themselves viewed Cusco as a living symbol, often described as the body of a puma, with Saxsayhuaman forming its head, a metaphor that places the site within a mytho-architectural framework where stone, geography and cosmology are inseparable. Spanish accounts describe the dismantling of parts of the complex for use in colonial buildings, a process that altered the site and erased potential clues. Yet even in its incomplete state, the remaining walls convey a sense of methodical intent rather than improvisation. Tool marks on the stones suggest the use of hammerstones and abrasion, consistent with known Andean techniques, but the time and coordination required to achieve the observed fit remain difficult to quantify, leaving open the possibility that Saxsayhuaman represents the culmination of a long, incremental tradition rather than a single burst of innovation. In later centuries, the site became a focal point for both resistance and remembrance, a place where the memory of Inca power persisted even as the empire itself faded, reinforcing the perception that Sacsayhuaman belonged to a deeper layer of history than the events recorded in colonial chronicles. Some modern interpretations have extended this depth backward into speculative eras, framing the site as evidence of a civilization lost to cataclysm. Yet such readings often overlook the continuity visible in Andean material culture and the adaptive intelligence of societies working within extreme environments. Still, the question lingers, not because the Inca were incapable, but because Sacsayhuaman reflects a threshold, a point at which human labor, geological understanding, and symbolic intent converge so completely that the result appears almost detached from the constraints that produced it. The walls do not announce their makers. They absorb sound, shadow, and time, standing as a reminder that in the Andes, history is often written not in texts but in stone, and that some structures endure precisely because they were built to outlast the stories told about them, leaving behind a form so resilient that it continues to suggest an origin rooted deeper than memory, even as it remains firmly anchored in the known world. Gunung Padang. Rising from the forested highlands of West Java, Gunung Padang appears at first as a natural hill, its slopes covered in vegetation and its summit shaped by erosion. Yet embedded within this landscape is a structure whose layered composition has gradually shifted it from obscurity into the centre of a careful and ongoing debate about the depth of human activity in the region. Known locally for generations as a sacred place, Gunung Padang occupies a volcanic ridge composed primarily of columnar andesite, a material that fractures naturally into prismatic blocks, lending the site an appearance that blurs the line between geology and architecture. At the surface, the visible remains consist of a series of terraces arranged along the crest of the hill, accessed by stone stairways and bordered by rows of upright columns, suggesting a ceremonial complex oriented toward the surrounding mountains and valleys. These surface features have been tentatively dated to the late prehistoric period, likely within the last few millennia, aligning them with other megalithic traditions found across Indonesia, where stone terraces and standing stones were used for ritual and social gathering. Beneath this visible layer, however, geophysical surveys and core samples have revealed additional anomalies, including buried stone alignments and compacted layers that some researchers interpret as evidence of earlier construction phases, potentially extending far deeper into the hill itself. Radiocarbon dates derived from organic material within these subsurface layers have produced a wide range of results, some falling well within accepted prehistoric timelines, others suggesting much earlier activity, though the interpretation of these dates remains contested due to questions about contamination, context, and whether the samples reflect human modification or natural processes. The idea that Gunung Padang might represent a multi-layered structure built incrementally over thousands of years challenges conventional models of site formation, particularly in a tropical environment where erosion, vegetation growth, and seismic activity complicate stratigraphic clarity. Skeptics argue that many of the deeper features can be explained by natural fracturing of volcanic rock combined with soil movement, emphasizing that columnar andesite naturally forms rectilinear patterns that can mimic deliberate construction when viewed in isolation. Proponents of a more complex interpretation counter that the apparent regularity, orientation, and repeated layering of stone elements exceed what would be expected from geology alone, suggesting intentional shaping and placement at multiple stages. What is not disputed is that the site has been modified by human activity at its summit, where stone arrangements and pathways clearly reflect planning and labour, indicating that Gunung Padang functioned as a significant cultural landmark long before modern investigation. The absence of associated artefacts, such as tools or habitation debris, complicates attempts to define the nature of this activity, pointing toward a primarily ceremonial or symbolic role rather than a settlement. Indonesia's position along tectonic boundaries adds another layer of complexity, as earthquakes and volcanic processes have repeatedly reshaped the landscape, potentially burying or altering earlier human features and making chronological separation difficult. Within a broader regional context, Gunung Padang sits among numerous megalithic sites across Southeast Asia, many of which display long-term reuse and adaptation, with later cultures building upon or reinterpreting earlier sacred spaces rather than replacing them. In this light, the hill may represent a palimpsest, where natural formation provided a foundation that successive human groups subtly reshaped, reinforcing its prominence and meaning over time. Claims that the site represents a fully artificial pyramid of extreme antiquity have captured public attention, but remain outside scholarly consensus, in part because the evidence does not yet support a clear distinction between natural and constructed layers at depth. Still, the ongoing research has had the effect of reopening questions about how early human communities in the region engaged with monumental space, particularly in environments where stone is abundant but preservation conditions are poor. Gunung Padang does not offer the clarity of a freestanding monument or a neatly stratified ruin. Instead, it presents a slow accumulation of signals, each open to interpretation, requiring methods that can reconcile geology with archaeology rather than favouring one over the other. As the terraces at the summit overlook the mist-filled valleys below, the site retains its original ambiguity, standing not as a definitive statement about lost civilizations, but as a reminder that the boundaries between natural landform and human intention are sometimes gradual rather than abrupt, and that in certain places history may be embedded not only in what was built upon the earth, but in how the earth itself was understood, shaped, and remembered across deep stretches of time. Megaliths of Carnac. Along the southern coast of Brittany, where the Atlantic winds move steadily inland and the land undulates in low, weathered rises, the megaliths of Carnac extend across the fields in long, measured rows, their repetition creating a rhythm that is at once orderly and elusive. Numbering in the thousands, these standing stones, or menhirs, are arranged in alignments that stretch for several kilometres, punctuated by stone circles, dolmens and burial mounds, forming one of the densest concentrations of prehistoric monuments in Europe. Radiocarbon dating and typological analysis place the primary phase of construction in the Neolithic period, roughly between 4,500 and 3000 BCE, a time when farming communities were becoming increasingly established across the region. Yet the sheer scale and coordination implied by the Carnac alignments suggest a level of social organisation and shared purpose that exceeds what is often casually assumed for early agrarian societies. The stones themselves are composed primarily of local granite, quarried from nearby outcrops and transported, shaped and erected with techniques that remain only partially understood, relying on human labour, wooden frameworks, ropes and earthworks, rather than metal tools or complex machinery. Individually, most of the stones are modest in size, though some weigh several tons. But collectively, they form an architectural gesture that is monumental not through vertical dominance, but through horizontal persistence, drawing the eye and the imagination along lines whose original function remains uncertain. The alignments are not perfectly straight. They subtly converge and diverge, rise and fall with the terrain, and vary in stone height, often diminishing toward one end, a pattern that suggests deliberate design rather than random placement. Interpretations have ranged from processional avenues and territorial markers to astronomical observatories and ritual landscapes. Yet none fully account for the complexity of the site, particularly given the apparent lack of a single focal structure or central axis. Excavations beneath some of the stones have revealed evidence of careful preparation, including stone packing and levelling, indicating that their placement was not improvised, while nearby burial monuments point to a broader ceremonial framework in which the living and the dead were integrated into a shared spatial order. Over centuries, the site appears to have evolved, with stones erected, removed or repurposed, suggesting that Carnac was not a static project, but a landscape continually reinterpreted by successive generations. Later communities, including Bronze Age and Iron Age groups, interacted with the stones, sometimes incorporating them into new monuments or folklore, while medieval and early modern accounts reflect a gradual loss of understanding, replacing original meanings with legend and speculation. The absence of written records from the Neolithic builders leaves interpretation dependent on material patterns, environmental context, and comparison with other megalithic sites across Atlantic Europe, from Stonehenge to the Iberian Peninsula, revealing a widespread tradition of monumentality rooted in stone, alignment, and landscape awareness. Some modern theories have attempted to connect Carnac to catastrophic events or forgotten civilizations, framing the alignments as remnants of a world erased by environmental upheaval. Yet the archaeological record instead points toward continuity, adaptation, and long-term investment rather than abrupt disappearance. Still, Carnac occupies a threshold space in human history, emerging at a moment when communities were redefining their relationship to land, time, and collective memory, and choosing to inscribe those relationships in stone on a scale that transcended individual lifespans. The labour required to raise thousands of stones implies not only manpower, but shared belief, coordination, and a willingness to devote resources to purposes that were symbolic rather than immediately practical. Today, as the alignments pass quietly through farmland and modern roads intersect their ancient paths, Carnac resists simplification, offering no single narrative that fully contains it. The stones stand neither as isolated monuments nor as components of a recognizable architectural complex, but as fragments of a larger, once coherent vision whose logic has thinned with time. In their enduring silence, they suggest that even without cities, writing, or metal, early societies were capable of shaping landscapes in ways that encoded meaning across generations, and that the true mystery of Carnac lies not in a lost civilization abruptly ended, but in a sustained cultural impulse whose origins and intentions remain just. Beyond the reach of reconstruction, preserved only in lines of stone that continue to mark the land long after their makers have faded into prehistory. Yonaguni Monument. Off the southwestern edge of Japan, where the East China Sea meets the Pacific and powerful currents sweep past the Ryukyu Islands, the submerged formations near Yonaguni rest in clear, shifting water, suspended between geological explanation and archaeological possibility. Discovered in the late 20th century by divers exploring coastal reefs, the Yonaguni Monument consists of a series of massive stone structures lying just offshore, characterized by flat terraces, sharp angles, stepped platforms, and what appear to be straight-edged walls rising from the sea floor. Carved into solid bedrock rather than assembled from blocks, the formations immediately drew attention for their resemblance to monumental architecture, prompting speculation that they represented the remains of a human-made complex submerged at the end of the last ice age, when rising sea levels transformed coastlines worldwide. The bedrock is composed primarily of sandstone and mudstone, layered sedimentary rocks known to fracture along plains that can produce rectilinear shapes, a fact that underpins the prevailing geological interpretation that the structures are natural, shaped by tectonic uplift, erosion, and wave action. The region is seismically active, and earthquakes have repeatedly fractured and tilted the strata, potentially accentuating angular forms and creating step-like features without human intervention. Yet the monument's apparent regularity continues to invite scrutiny, as some surfaces appear unusually smooth. Corners meet at near right angles, and certain features resemble stairways, platforms, or even carved reliefs, blurring the line between coincidence and intention. Marine geologists point out that similar formations can be found along other coastlines with comparable geology, though few present such a concentrated and visually coherent arrangement in a single location. Archaeological surveys of the surrounding seabed have yielded limited cultural material, offering no definitive tools, artifacts, or debris that would clearly indicate human construction, a notable absence given the scale implied by the formations. Proponents of a cultural interpretation argue that any associated artifacts may have been dispersed, buried, or degraded by marine processes over millennia, particularly if submergence occurred gradually rather than catastrophically. The timing of sea level rise following the last glacial maximum places the submergence of Yonaguni's coastal shelf between roughly 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, a period during which human populations in the region were transitioning from Paleolithic to early Neolithic lifeways, leaving open the theoretical possibility of shoreline modification or symbolic carving rather than full-scale urban construction. However, no comparable stone architecture is known from the Japanese archipelago or nearby regions from such an early period, complicating attempts to situate Yonaguni within a broader cultural framework. The debate has often polarized into opposing camps, one emphasizing natural processes, the other highlighting perceived anomalies. Yet the site itself resists such binaries, presenting features that are convincingly geological in isolation, but collectively provocative in form. Over time, the monument has been subjected to repeated surveys, photogrammetry, and diver documentation, refining our understanding of its structure without resolving its origin conclusively. Whether shaped entirely by nature or subtly modified by human hands, Yonaguni occupies a conceptual shoreline as well as a physical one, marking a boundary between what is known and what remains plausible but unproven. Its submerged state adds another dimension to its ambiguity, reminding us that vast stretches of human history unfolded along coastlines that no longer exist, now hidden beneath rising seas. In this sense, Yonaguni does not demand acceptance as a lost city to remain significant. Its value lies in how it draws attention to the fragility of the archaeological record in dynamic environments, and the ease with which entire chapters of early human activity could be rendered nearly invisible. As light filters down through the water and currents move across the stone, the monument endures as a form shaped by time, pressure, and interpretation, offering no inscriptions or clear declarations, only surfaces that continue to invite careful observation, and a quiet suggestion that the story of human interaction with the sea may be older and more complex than the evidence we are currently able to recover.
Aswan, unfinished obelisk. In the granite quarries of Aswan, where the Nile bends through southern Egypt and the desert presses close to the river's edge, the unfinished obelisk lies embedded in the bedrock, silent and immense, as though paused between intention and abandonment. Carved directly from a single outcrop of red granite, the obelisk was intended to stand over 40 meters tall and weigh more than 1,000 tons, surpassing all completed examples erected throughout Egypt's long history. Unlike standing obelisks, whose origins must be inferred from texts and finished monuments, this one offers a rare glimpse into the process of ancient stone extraction, preserving tool marks, channels, and working surfaces in a state that appears almost contemporary. The obelisk is generally attributed to the reign of Queen Hatshepsut in the 18th dynasty, when obelisk building reached a peak as expressions of solar worship and royal authority. Yet its sheer scale suggests an ambition that pushed even Egypt's formidable engineering traditions to their limits. The granite was separated from the surrounding bedrock by carving narrow trenches along its length, using dolerite hammerstones to pound and fracture the stone, a labour-intensive method that required patience, coordination, and an intimate understanding of the material's properties. Partway through this process, a crack appeared in the stone, running along one side and rendering the obelisk structurally unsound, leading to its abandonment before it could be freed and transported to the Nile. This flaw, preserved in situ, is often cited as evidence of trial and error rather than flawless execution, grounding Egypt's monumental achievements in practical realities rather than mythic perfection. Yet, the decision to attempt an obelisk of such unprecedented size raises questions about motivation and precedent, as no finished monument of comparable dimensions was ever completed, suggesting either a moment of extraordinary confidence or the continuation of a longer tradition whose upper limits were still being tested. The logistics implied by the project are considerable. Had the obelisk been successfully extracted, it would have required careful lowering, transport over land to the river, and shipment north to a temple site,
all without iron tools, modern cranes, or mechanical advantage beyond ropes, sledges, and human labour. Egyptian reliefs and texts provide partial insight into these processes, depicting obelisks hauled by teams of workers and floated on barges. Yet they offer little detail on how stones approaching this scale were managed in practice. The Aswan quarries themselves bear witness to centuries of activity, with smaller obelisks, statues, and blocks extracted nearby, indicating that the unfinished obelisk was not an isolated experiment, but part of a broader industrial landscape shaped by long experience. Still, its abandonment marks a boundary, a point at which ambition met material constraint. And in doing so, it reveals something essential about ancient engineering: that mastery does not eliminate risk, and that even highly developed traditions operate within limits defined by stone, labour, and time. In modern discourse, the obelisk has occasionally been invoked as evidence of lost technologies or forgotten methods. Yet its visible tool marks and incomplete state argue instead for continuity, showing how monumental works were achieved through accumulation of effort rather than sudden technological leaps. What remains compelling is not the mystery of how the obelisk would have been moved, but the fact that it was conceived at all, reflecting a cultural environment in which extreme scale was not only imaginable, but worth attempting. As sunlight traces the grooves left by ancient workers and shadows deepen along the cracked edge, the unfinished obelisk stands as a moment frozen in Egypt's long engagement with stone, offering clarity rather than concealment, and reminding us that some of the most revealing monuments are those that were never finished, preserving in their stillness a record of intention, capability, and the quiet acknowledgement of limits within a civilization often remembered for seeming to defy them.
Lesotho ledges. High in the mountains of Lesotho, where the Drakensberg Range rises into steep basalt escarpments and weather moves quickly across open skies, a series of enigmatic stone ledges and stepped formations trace the contours of cliffs and slopes, drawing attention less through monumentality than through their improbable placement. Known informally as the Lesotho ledges, these features appear as narrow linear platforms cut or arranged along sheer rock faces, often at elevations that seem difficult to access without deliberate planning. From a distance, they resemble natural terraces shaped by erosion. Yet their repeated spacing, consistent width, and occasional right-angled turns suggest a pattern that resists simple geological explanation. The basalt geology of the region is prone to columnar jointing and horizontal fracturing, processes that can produce ledges and shelves over time. And this has led many geologists to interpret the formations as entirely natural, the result of differential weathering acting on layered volcanic rock. However, in several locations, the ledges appear unusually regular, with smoothed surfaces and abrupt terminations that invite closer examination, raising the possibility that human hands may have modified or expanded naturally occurring features rather than creating them from scratch. The highlands of Lesotho have been inhabited for tens of thousands of years, with evidence of Middle Stone Age occupation and later use by pastoralist communities, though these groups are not typically associated with large-scale stone construction. The absence of associated artifacts or habitation remains near the ledges complicates interpretation, leaving their function, if any, open to speculation. Some have proposed that the ledges served as pathways, defensive positions, or platforms for ritual or signalling, taking advantage of elevated vantage points across valleys and passes.
while others suggest more utilitarian uses related to herding or resource management in a rugged environment. Oral traditions in the region are sparse regarding the features, offering little narrative guidance, though local familiarity with the landscape has long recognized the ledges as distinctive elements rather than anomalies. In broader discussions, the Lesotho ledges have occasionally been drawn into arguments about lost or forgotten phases of African prehistory, framed as evidence that early societies engaged in more extensive landscape modification than is currently acknowledged. Such interpretations remain tentative, in part because the line between natural formation and minimal human alteration is difficult to define in basalt terrain, where small interventions can appear monumental over time. What the ledges do clearly demonstrate is the complexity of reading ancient landscapes, particularly in regions where stone, climate, and long-term erosion interact in ways that can mimic intention. Africa's deep prehistory is marked by mobility, adaptability, and technologies that often leave light archaeological footprints, making it possible that certain forms of modification would escape easy classification. The Lesotho ledges do not announce themselves as ruins, nor do they conform to recognizable architectural traditions, and this ambiguity has contributed to their marginal place in mainstream research. Yet their persistence across wide areas of the highlands suggests that they are not isolated curiosities, but part of a recurring pattern embedded in the terrain itself. Whether shaped primarily by natural forces or subtly guided by human use, the ledges occupy a space between explanation and uncertainty, reminding us that not all ancient interactions with stone resulted in freestanding monuments or durable settlements. In the mountains of Lesotho, where survival has always depended on an intimate understanding of cliffs, weather, and movement across difficult ground, it is possible that the most enduring traces of human presence are those that blend so thoroughly with the land that they become almost indistinguishable from it, leaving behind features that continue to suggest intention without ever fully surrendering their origin to certainty.
Nabta Playa. In the far reaches of Egypt's western desert, deep within the Nubian Sahara, where aridity now defines the landscape, Nabta Playa lies in a basin that was once seasonally filled with water, transforming what is today a desolate expanse into a temporary refuge during the African humid period. Thousands of years ago, between roughly 9,000 and 4,000 BCE, monsoon rains shifted northward, allowing grasslands, shallow lakes, and migratory wildlife to flourish in regions that are now inhospitable. And it was within this transient environment that human groups repeatedly gathered at Nabta Playa. The archaeological remains are subtle rather than imposing at first glance, consisting of stone circles, alignments, tumuli, and shallow basins. Yet their placement and patterning reveal an engagement with landscape and sky that suggests deliberate planning rather than casual occupation. Among the most studied features is a small stone circle composed of upright slabs arranged in a ring, sometimes described as one of the earliest known examples of archaeoastronomy, as certain stones appear to align with solar events such as the summer solstice, coinciding with the seasonal arrival of rains that would have sustained life in the basin. Radiocarbon dates from hearths and habitation debris indicate repeated use of the site by pastoral communities who herded cattle, gathered wild plants, and adapted to a climate in flux, returning to Nabta Playa over centuries rather than occupying it continuously. These groups were not sedentary in the later agricultural sense,
Yet they invested labour in constructing stone features whose function extended beyond immediate survival, suggesting ritual, social coordination, and shared cosmological understanding. Larger megalithic arrangements, including lines of stones stretching across the playa and complex burial structures, point to an increasing formalization of space over time, with certain areas reserved for ceremonial or symbolic purposes. Some tumuli contain cattle remains arranged in deliberate ways, reinforcing the central role of livestock not only as economic assets, but as cultural and possibly spiritual focal points. The stones themselves were transported from local sources, moved and erected without metal tools or beasts of burden, relying instead on human effort and environmental knowledge. A reminder that monumentality does not require urban density or permanent architecture to emerge. As the climate gradually dried and the monsoon retreated southward, Nabta Playa became less viable as a seasonal gathering place, and its users appear to have migrated toward more reliable water sources, including the Nile Valley. This movement has drawn attention to potential cultural continuities, as certain symbolic elements observed at Nabta Playa, such as cattle veneration and attention to celestial cycles, later appear in more elaborate forms within pre-dynastic and dynastic Egyptian culture. While direct lines of influence are difficult to establish, the possibility that ideas developed in the desert informed later Nile-based societies adds depth to the site's significance. Nabta Playa does not present the imposing scale of later Egyptian monuments, yet in its context it represents a threshold moment where mobile communities began to formalize their relationship with time, seasonality, and the cosmos through enduring markers in stone. Modern interpretations that frame the site as evidence of a lost, advanced civilization often overlook this nuance, as the archaeological record instead points to gradual innovation shaped by environmental opportunity rather than sudden technological leaps. Still, the sophistication implied by the alignments and the long-term reuse of the site challenges assumptions that complex symbolic behavior emerged only alongside agriculture and permanent settlement. As the desert winds move across the basin today, partially burying and revealing the stones in shifting sand, Nabta Playa remains a quiet testament to human adaptability during a climatic window that has long since closed, preserving traces of a world where monumentality arose not from surplus and empire, but from the need to understand cycles of water, sky, and survival in a landscape that was itself temporary, leaving behind a pattern of stone that continues to suggest a deep and patient intelligence at work long before history began to be written.